Thank you, MC, Master of Ceremony. I've been asked to speak. That was the question I was sent. I will try and talk to some of the issues raised by other panelists, but I thought we will sit together and debate. I think that might still be coming. So I will really just go through my presentation. I have tried for once not to have too many words. I usually write presentations that have too many words, and I've tried instead to just have lots of pictures today. And the question I was sent says, in an underdeveloped sector, such as the music industry in South Africa, can legislation or regulation foster and change or create an enabling environment? I have to answer the question, but the question itself poses a problem for me because I disagree that the South African music industry is underdeveloped. It might have problems, but it is certainly not underdeveloped. Just using the PwC Media Entertainment statistics 2021, you'll see that music, radio, and podcasts for 2021, the spending on this sector was around 5.4 billion rands. Spending, consumer spending, on music, on podcast, on radio. You'll see there's other categories, TV, and TV, obviously, we're still consuming a lot of content through TV. That's where the spending is. You'll see that spending over internet has grown substantially from 2017 at 46 billion to 81 billion in 2021, consumer spending. So South Africans spent a total of 163 billion in the media and entertainment sector, whether it's music, whether it's books, whether it's newspapers, whether it's internet, that's how much we're spending. So I wanted just to dispel that we have an underdeveloped sector. We have a developed sector, and the music industry is developed. Now, the profits from this 169 billion might not be shared better. Maybe that's the question. But that this sector is growing and it has its challenges, and you'll see that there was a dip after COVID, but the growth is coming up again. And yes, you'll see the growth is also on the online spaces and not on the live spaces. This is from the International Federation of Phonographic Industry, which is the music recording industry. Shows that South Africa, although it dipped by 2%, its market size. Now, this is not market size of the whole music industry. This is market size of the recording industry. Yeah? Not the live performance. This is just recording industry. That's our size, $51.7 million, which is around about, if you calculate that at around times 20, that gives you about the value of our industry in rands of the recording industry. And you'll see that the different, obviously physical sales is dropping, but streaming and other digital is growing. Performing rights, which is your live, which is also shows a bit of a drop. And globally, out of 60 countries, we are number 35. I don't want to go through that list, but you'll see that South Africa is there at number 35. The US is still the biggest market, followed by Japan, followed by the UK, Germany, and France, and South Korea. This sector is developed. It has challenges, and some of it could be regulatory, some of it could be about implementation. I won't speak to this, but I just wanted to say that in terms of sector organizations, we just picked the two bigger sector organizations. RISA represents about 3,000 record both your major labels and independent labels. SAMRO representing composers and publishers, about 15,000 publishers and composers with SAMRO. So that's the size of our industry. It's a developed sector. It has its challenges. But in certain regions, maybe the development is not as strong. Again, we know that our sector is centralized around the three, mainly first Gauteng, as in Joburg, Tshwane, Cape Town, and then eThekwini. Sometimes we say KZN when we mean eThekwini, or we say Western Cape when we mean Cape Town. But that's where it's centralized, and that's a challenge about how do we ensure that it reaches out. But it is a substantive industry. And the question is to be or not to be, to regulate or not to regulate. You can over-regulate. There's countries which are autocracies where even you are told almost everything that you must do by government. But essentially, it's a challenge for every government. How much do you regulate and how much do you not over-regulate? And the key thing, if you take the Triple BE Act, where you're saying the sector must create its own sector codes, but these might fit the law. It must be in line with the law. So there is a way where you can regulate and allow for self-regulation. And that's what we must strive for, because there is a need to create some regulation, but also to give the sector the space to regulate themselves. Obviously, if they fight for other, we might have to regulate. So why don't we have one metadata collection system? Maybe we must regulate that there must be one. And we don't leave it to the sector to say, no, I don't want to work with SAMRO, or even the very SABCs or broadcast are not actually supplying the data in a format that fits everyone. So maybe that is something that we must regulate, so that then the information is equally accessed and we create that one backroom. In actual fact, the copyright review report went almost to saying we must do that, but it said any ISP, any user of this information, if they do not keep proper records of this data, they can lose their license to operate. And that must be in the law. Unfortunately, the Broadcasting Act has not been amended to include that as yet. So, as government, we're looking at not only regulation, how do you create an enabling environment? You need some form of regulation. And this is part of the master plan process where we create master plans, where you say, you look at the sector, where are the challenges and what do we need to do? And some of the tools you can use could be policy or legislation. You could use competition policy or intellectual property policy and other various policies. But also, you could be using, for instance, incentives, which we do, where we say, okay, we want to grow the sector. We've created some regulations, but there's a need to incentivize growth, and therefore companies who are investing will give them a tax break, or we give them some additional funding for them to grow. So it's a mix of tools that we need to use to create that enabling environment, because regulation on its own creates some rules for markets to operate well, but it's not enough. The bigger challenge, obviously, is that as government, we could create regulation. Excuse me. Ms. Mapike mentioned the construction industry, wherein there are contracts that are sort of standard contracts and codes, or even for subcontracting. If I'm the main contractor and I subcontract, there's actually a whole process and book that is already established. But you see, that is possible because the actual Building Act calls for that, and then leave the sector to do it, but the actual act says you must do that. And maybe we need that also, but you would know obviously why in the building industry it has been made almost compulsory. Because you know other countries, people build triple stories, and then after some few rains, the whole building collapses. And that sector is because of that there is that emphasis. But it doesn't mean that our own sector can't have situations where we create certain legislation, but for it to be effectively implemented, the industry must then create the sector codes based on the broader regulation. The next slides are just for information, because someone was saying, possibly we don't need new legislation. The problem is we need to fix existing legislation. The problem is how do we use existing legislation also? And this is just arts and culture legislations. And if you scan on them, I want you to tell me if you can pick any that talks to how artists and companies can contract. They are almost all about regulating institutions, establishing the Film Cultural Laws Act, establishing the National Arts Council that other people here work for, and how they should fund. They are all about, how to fund libraries. None of them are talking to how you contract between artists and maybe a company, between a venue. The contracting part is not covered by these laws. This is DTI legislation. I'm going to skip quickly, but I think some of you must think about this. Are you artists or are you businesses? And if you are businesses, are you registered as businesses? Are you a company? If you are, there's actually a companies tribunal. So here you are, you're artist, you work together, you record, you are a band, then you break up. Then we don't know who the name of the band belongs to. Then all the issues come up. Besides the splits, there are other intellectual issues that come out from that because how you contracted as an artist to form that entity, is not structured. Again, if you are registered as a company, you have the company's tribunal, which you can actually take your case to for free, for them to adjudicate. There's another tribunal or agents, regulated agents, besides CIPC, company's tribunal. And so this other space here is about how we promote exports and other things. It's about growing our sector. Remember that also many artists here, I don't know if you've been on these trade missions or gone to to WOMEX or to South by Southwest, which is actually, those trips are funded by the state to actually grow exports. So, and that is provided for by the laws that exist. Okay, I want to talk to the other laws about property. Interestingly, these are the laws that exist around intellectual property. And yes, we must fix some. We are busy with amending the Copyright Act and the Performance Protection Act. And someone spoke about, yes, we've built this brand. I mean, how do you protect a brand through trademark? How many of you have trademark your logos and name as artists or bands? You see, yes, there's copyright, but there's also trademark because later on, people then start wanting to use your image or your name to sell other things, but you haven't trademarked it. So and you don't need the Trademark Act to say it's talking to artists, it's talking to everyone. So we can't do one separate for you. You must use existing one. And, well, the last one, obviously, is remember the Konjubanu Mama Lwe Gospel, Washama Pakistan, things ama cassette work illegally. We also have that law that talks to how we deal with counterfeit goods. Obviously, the state is a process of how you report that and how we can deal with people who are doing counterfeit goods. Obviously, now most of the counterfeit is online than just physical CDs. So I'm saying there's more than enough legislation. I'm going to skip all of this. But oh, by the way, those two legislation, Lotteries Act, you would know that, especially for organizations like KUMISA, that 27% of the funding in lotteries goes to arts development, arts organization, etc. Even, by the way, the Gambling Act is relevant to us because all casinos, have you noticed, must have a theater and must spend funding on the arts. It's law, it's part of their mandate. I'm going to skip all of this. Still with all those legislation, remember that all the Copyright Act or IP legislation is dealing with your IP, your trademarks, your copyright in terms of your artistic works. If you also design clothes, because some artists are now into clothes design, you would need to register those designs or trademark that. They're dealing with your intellectual property. A big challenge we have is that we are all small businesses, but we are left to deal with contract laws according to the normal, what is called TOT, the normal contracting law in the country. Now, and you're a small artist and you have to take to court Sony or whoever big company. Or for that matter, you must take to court the department who hired you for the gig, then they're not paying you. And you don't have the money to do that. Now, if I'm an employee and I have a problem with my employer, which is Department of Small Business, I go to the CCMA, I get recourse for free. We don't have that. We have the other laws that need fixing. But when it comes to this relationship of the artist, who is not an employee of the record company, but actually a contractor, independent contractor, we don't have access to justice for that, or how we could establish minimum standards or a legal framework to protect the independent contractors. The IP laws, yes, they need to be fixed. Issues of streaming, whatever, there's things we can tweak and fix, but the real gap is here. That's where the problem is. If you've been went to a festival and you're not paid, and etc., and the festival shoots the whole concert and now starts selling the video, where do you go? That's where the challenge is. But a solution exists. Already in 1980 at UNESCO, we said we need to discuss this thing about the artist, the status of the artist. 1980. And the idea was, how do you deal with issues around the artist and policy measures relating to training, to social security. Social security, when you die, suddenly they say you have no medical aid, or you get sick on tour, you don't have medical aid. Because whether you are not, medical aid depends on a monthly salary. How do you deal with social security of the artist? How do we deal with other employment and standards issues? Someone spoke about a code of conduct, about contracting and those relationships. There's been proposals made globally in 1980 about how do we begin to deal with this matter. Some countries have moved, some countries have not. Canada has moved and created what they call the Status of the Artist Act. And through this legislation, they've said, you are an independent contractor, the record companies are not your employees. But they can come together as artists in an association and negotiate working standards and rules and minimums. Here's the other thing. Artists will forever obviously negotiate differently in terms of your stature, how famous your music is, how well it sells, and that is the nature of the industry. But through such a process where you say, let's create a threshold, a basement, where we know that there are at least certain thresholds, minimums, and rates going up, it can be done if you create a situation where, even though I'm not an employee, I am subcontracting, but us as a group of subcontractors, as artists, can be accredited to negotiate with the, say, record companies as association or promoters association to minimum working standards, minimum types of pay, but which allows still the different categories of artists to negotiate on their own. It's doable. It's already being done in Canada, in Belgium, in a few other countries where you actually take this approach. One of the reasons why all the unions we start fail. I mean, KUMISA was registered as a union, and I think MUSA first. And then later when Department of Labor assessed them, they said, but there's no employees and regular payment of union fees, etc. You are not a union. They were deregistered. Even when COSATU helped that MUSA and KUMISA gets registered, they said the Labor Relations Act doesn't cover you. You're representing independent contractors. But such a legislation could create that base for how unions could be accredited to do these negotiations and to be able to create some level of negotiation strength, and also how we could then move towards creating some form of what's the word, social security. And that's something that we've spoken about a bit before, and there was a time when we were saying, if CMOs like Samro can say, because we're collecting fees from users, we can then be able for our members to start paying on a monthly basis towards a medical aid or a funeral benefit. So if it's doable there, how do we replicate this to other subsectors, whether away from collecting societies, but to the whole of the industry? That, for me, is the biggest gap, that we haven't created this, another way to think about it, about protection, or even how do you protect and enable independent contractors to contract collectively and create a minimum standards and thresholds that will support the sector to grow, and also will protect them as independent contractors. Self-regulation, I agree with it, and the trick is, how do we create laws that create the framework for effective self-regulation? Because the best self-regulation in many countries is that the broader law, the framework of that law, creates the basis of how you can self-regulate as an industry. Even in South Africa, take the financial institutions, insurance companies. They self-regulate, but it's under the Insurances Act. The banks self-regulate, but it's under the Banking Act that comes from National Treasury that creates the foundation for the banks to self-regulate. So we need to create that framework for the industry to better self-regulate, but most important, we need to protect independent contracting. Australia has done that. New Zealand has done that. I think South Korea has done that. Japan has done that. Japan has said, we will support Toyota and Nissan to grow as big companies, but you must subcontract small businesses to supply the small components, the lights, the whatever. And they have put protection for that those small contractors are properly trained and developed, and there is a good sort of growth of the sector as a whole. Because also, we find that sometimes governments do fund these big entities, but they need to pull up the smaller companies in the industry. Therein lies the problem. That's the legislative gap that we face. Thank you. I will answer the questions by fellow panelists maybe when we sit there.